Ladies and gentlemen, today I want to speak to you about something every human heart wrestles with at one time or another: fear of the unknown and the struggle to trust God with what we cannot see. Fear has a quiet way of settling into our thoughts. It whispers questions late at night, it follows us into important decisions, and it often disguises itself as caution or wisdom. Yet beneath it all, fear is simply a lack of trust in where God is taking us. And until we learn to let go of that fear, we will never fully experience the peace, purpose, and strength God desires for us. Fear often begins when God calls us to move forward while giving us only part of the picture. We want clarity, guarantees, and reassurance that everything will work out exactly as we imagine. But God rarely works that way. He invites us to walk by faith, not by sight. When He leads, He does not always explain the full plan, because trust is built not through explanations, but through obedience. If God showed us every detail, we would rely on information instead of relying on Him. Many people stay stuck, not because God has abandoned them, but because fear has convinced them it is safer to remain where they are. Fear says, "What if you fail?" Faith says, "What if God is faithful?" Fear focuses on what could go wrong, while faith rests in who God is. When you understand the character of God, His goodness, His wisdom, His love, you begin to realize that wherever He is leading you, it cannot be a place of harm, even if it involves challenge. Trusting God does not mean the absence of fear. It means choosing obedience in spite of fear. Courage is not the feeling of confidence. It is the decision to move forward even when your hands are trembling. God never promised that the path would be easy, but He did promise that He would never leave you nor forsake you. When you step into the unknown with God, you are never stepping alone. Fear also grows when we try to control outcomes that belong only to God. We plan, we worry, we analyze every possible scenario, and still we feel uneasy. Control gives the illusion of security, but it never gives peace. Peace comes from surrender. When you finally place your future into God's hands, you discover that His hands are far steadier than yours could ever be. Sometimes fear is rooted in past experiences. You trusted once and were hurt. You stepped out once and failed. And now fear tells you, do not risk it again. But God is not asking you to trust your past experiences. He is asking you to trust Him. Your past may have shaped you, but it does not define your future. God redeems what was broken and uses even your failures to prepare you for what is ahead. Trusting where God is taking you also requires patience. God's timing rarely aligns with ours. We want immediate answers and quick results, but God is far more concerned with developing our character than satisfying our schedule. Delays are not denials, they are often preparation. In the waiting, God strengthens our faith, deepens our dependence, and teaches us to listen more closely to His voice. Fear tends to exaggerate obstacles and minimize God's power. It magnifies the storm and forgets who controls the wind and waves. When fear rises, remind yourself of what God has already done. Reflect on the times He provided when you saw no way, protected you when you were unaware of danger, and comforted you when your heart was broken. The same God who was faithful then is faithful now. Trust also means accepting that God's way may look different from what you expected. Sometimes He closes doors you desperately wanted to walk through, not to punish you, but to protect you. Other times He leads you down a path you never would have chosen, only to reveal blessings you never could have imagined. God sees what you cannot see, and He knows what you do not know. Trusting Him means believing that His perspective is always greater than yours. Letting go of fear is a daily decision. Fear does not disappear once and for all. It must be surrendered again and again. Each morning you choose whether you will live by fear or by faith. Each decision is an opportunity to say, God, I do not understand everything, but I trust you. And every time you make that choice, your faith grows stronger. When you trust God, you begin to walk with a quiet confidence, not because life is predictable, but because God is dependable. You learn to rest even when circumstances are uncertain. You discover peace that does not depend on outcomes, and you experience freedom from the constant burden of worry. God is always moving you toward His best, even when the journey feels uncomfortable. He uses transitions to stretch your faith and deepen your relationship with Him. The place you are headed may require you to release familiar comforts, old habits, or even certain relationships, but what God has prepared ahead is worth the surrender. So when fear rises, do not run from it. Bring it to God. Speak honestly with Him. Admit your doubts, your worries, and your questions. God is not threatened by your fear. He invites you to trust Him in the middle of it. And as you do, you will find that fear loses its grip and faith begins to lead. Trusting where God is taking you does not mean you will never struggle, but it does mean you will never be without hope. God's purpose for your life is greater than your fear, stronger than your doubt, and more secure than your circumstances. As you let go of fear and place your trust in Him, you step into a life guided not by anxiety, but by faith, confidence, and the unshakable assurance that God knows the way even when you do not. Fear often begins its work quietly, almost unnoticed, shaping our thoughts before we realize what is happening. It usually takes hold when we face uncertainty and feel the need to understand everything in advance. We want to know how things will turn out, what challenges we will face, and whether the outcome will justify the risk. When those answers are missing, fear steps in and fills the gaps with worry and doubt. But at the heart of that fear is not the unknown itself. It is where we place our focus. When our attention is fixed on what we cannot see or control, fear grows stronger. But when our attention is centered on who God is, fear begins to lose its power. The unknown feels threatening because it reminds us of our limitations. We are finite beings who prefer certainty and predictability. We like clear paths and detailed plans. Yet God, in His wisdom, often leads us in ways that require trust rather than full understanding. He does not always reveal the next step far in advance because He knows that if we had all the details, we might depend on information instead of depending on Him. The unknown is not meant to paralyze us. It is meant to draw us closer to God. Fear magnifies questions such as, what if I fail? Or what if this goes wrong? Faith responds by asking a different question. Who is God, and can He be trusted? When you focus on God's character, fear begins to shrink. God is faithful, consistent, loving, and wise. He does not make careless decisions, and He does not lead His people without purpose. The same God who has guided generations before you is guiding you now, and He has not lost His ability to lead. When fear dominates our thinking, it often distorts reality. It takes a possibility and turns it into a certainty of disaster. It exaggerates obstacles and minimizes God's power. Suddenly, the challenges ahead seem enormous, and God seems distant. But the truth is that God has not changed, and His power has not diminished. The problem is not the size of the obstacle, it is the direction of our focus. When we focus on the obstacle, fear grows. When we focus on God, faith grows. Understanding God's character is essential to overcoming fear. God is not only powerful, He is good. He is not only wise, He is loving. This means that wherever He is leading you, His intentions are rooted in love, even if the path feels uncomfortable. God does not lead His children into uncertainty to harm them, but to refine them, strengthen them, and prepare them for what lies ahead. When you trust His character, you can rest even when you do not understand His methods. Fear also thrives when we forget how God has worked in our past. We easily remember past pain, but overlook past faithfulness. Yet, if we pause and reflect, we can see countless moments where God provided, protected, and guided us through situations that once seemed impossible. The unknown you are facing today is not greater than the challenges God has already brought you through. Remembering His past faithfulness builds confidence for the future. Another reason fear grows is because we assume responsibility for outcomes that belong to God. We believe it is up to us to make everything work out perfectly. This burden was never meant for us to carry. God asks for our obedience, not our perfection. He calls us to follow, not to control. When we shift our focus from managing outcomes to trusting God's direction, fear begins to loosen its grip. Trusting God's character also means accepting that His perspective is higher than ours. What looks like a setback to us may be a setup for something greater. What feels like a delay may be divine protection. God sees the entire picture while we see only a fragment. When fear arises, it is often because we are interpreting the future through our limited understanding instead of through God's limitless wisdom. Fear tells us that the unknown is dangerous, but faith reminds us that God is already there. He does not wait for you to arrive before He begins working. He goes before you, preparing the way. Wherever God is taking you, His presence will meet you there. This truth changes how we view uncertainty. The unknown is no longer a place of threat, but a place where God's guidance will be revealed step by step. As you learn to focus less on what you do not know and more on who God is, fear loses its authority. Peace does not come from having all the answers. It comes from trusting the one who does. When your confidence is rooted in God's character rather than in your understanding, you are able to move forward with a steady heart, knowing that even when the path is unclear, the one leading you is perfectly trustworthy. Trusting God often calls us to move forward. Moments when we feel least prepared and least confident. Many people believe that obedience comes after confidence, that once they feel strong enough or certain enough, they will act, but faith works in the opposite direction. God invites us to obey first, and confidence follows later. Fear tells us to wait until we feel ready, but readiness is rarely a feeling. It is a decision to trust God, even when our emotions resist. Obedience in the presence of fear is one of the clearest expressions of genuine faith. Fear does not automatically disappear when God calls us to act. In fact, fear often intensifies at the very moment God is leading us into growth. This is because obedience stretches us beyond what feels safe and familiar. Yet God never expects us to overcome fear through our own strength. He asks us to step forward, relying on His strength, trusting that He will supply what we lack. Many people delay obedience because they are waiting for perfect clarity. They want assurance that every detail will work out, that every risk will be minimized, and that every outcome will be favorable. But God rarely provides that level of certainty. If He did, obedience would be based on evidence rather than faith. Faith begins where certainty ends. When you choose to obey without having all the answers, you are declaring that God's wisdom is greater than your understanding. Fear often exaggerates the cost of obedience while ignoring the cost of disobedience. It focuses on what you might lose, what could go wrong, or how uncomfortable the journey might be. But it rarely considers what is lost when we refuse to obey. Delayed obedience often leads to missed opportunities, prolonged frustration, and spiritual stagnation. When we allow fear to dictate our choices, we may preserve temporary comfort but sacrifice long-term growth. Obedience does not require confidence in yourself. It requires confidence in God. Many people struggle because they feel inadequate, unqualified, or unsure of their abilities. But God has never chosen people based on their self-confidence. He chooses willing hearts. When God calls you, He already knows your weaknesses, limitations, and fears. He does not expect you to bring strength. He expects you to bring surrender. Fear convinces us that failure is final, but obedience teaches us that failure can be part of God's process. Stepping out in faith does not guarantee immediate success. There may be setbacks, mistakes, and moments of doubt along the way, but God uses each of these experiences to teach, refine, and mature us. Obedience is not about flawless performance. It is about faithful response. Often the first step of obedience feels the hardest because it requires letting go of familiar ground. The unknown can feel overwhelming, especially when it challenges our sense of security. Yet God rarely asks us to take the entire journey at once. He asks for one step, then another. Each step of obedience builds spiritual strength, even if confidence lags behind. Fear also tries to isolate us, making us believe we are alone in our struggle. But obedience connects us more deeply to God's presence. When you act in obedience, you experience God's guidance in ways you could not experience by standing still. His direction becomes clearer as you move, not before you move. Trust grows through action, not avoidance. Waiting for fear to disappear before obeying often leads to a cycle of hesitation and regret. Fear feeds on inactivity, growing stronger the longer we delay. Obedience, on the other hand, weakens fear. Each time you choose to obey despite fear, fear loses some of its control over your life. You discover that God's grace meets you in motion. God honors obedience that comes from trust rather than certainty. When you obey without confidence, you demonstrate that your faith is not rooted in feelings, but in God's character. This kind of obedience deepens your relationship with God and strengthens your spiritual resilience. You begin to realize that God is more interested in your willingness than in your comfort. Trusting God enough to obey when confidence is absent requires humility. It means admitting that you do not have all the answers and that you need God's guidance. This humility opens the door for God to work powerfully in your life. As you take each step in obedience, confidence slowly grows, not because circumstances become easier, but because your trust in God becomes stronger. Many people believe peace comes from having control over their circumstances, but control is often the very thing that robs us of peace. We try to manage every detail of our lives, thinking that if we plan carefully enough and anticipate every possible outcome, we can protect ourselves from disappointment or pain. Yet the more we cling to control, the more anxious we become. This is because control was never meant to be our source of security. Peace does not come from holding everything together. It comes from placing everything into God's hands. The desire for control is rooted in fear of uncertainty. When we do not know what lies ahead, we attempt to compensate by tightening our grip on what we can influence. We monitor situations closely, worry excessively, and replay conversations and decisions in our minds. But no amount of control can eliminate uncertainty. Instead, it often amplifies it. True peace begins when we accept that some things are beyond our control and choose to trust God with what we cannot manage. Surrender is often misunderstood as weakness, but in reality, it is an act of deep faith. To surrender means acknowledging that God's wisdom exceeds our own and that His plans are better than anything we could design. When we surrender control, we are not giving up responsibility. We are releasing the burden of outcomes that belong to God alone. This shift brings relief because we no longer carry a weight we were never meant to bear. Many people resist surrender because they fear it will lead to loss. They worry that if they let go, God may take something away or lead them somewhere uncomfortable. But surrender to God does not lead to loss. It leads to alignment. When your life aligns with God's will, you experience a sense of purpose and peace that cannot be produced by human effort. God does not strip away what is good. He removes what prevents growth. Control often gives the illusion of safety, but it cannot provide lasting peace. Even when things seem stable, anxiety remains, because deep down we know how fragile control really is. One unexpected event can disrupt even the most carefully constructed plans. Peace rooted in God, however, remains steady even when circumstances change. It is not dependent on predictability, but on trust in God's unchanging nature. S. Surrender also frees us from the pressure of perfection. When we believe everything depends on us, we feel compelled to get everything right. This mindset creates constant stress and fear of failure. But when we surrender outcomes to God, we understand that our role is obedience, not perfection. God works through imperfect people who are willing to trust Him. Another challenge with control is that it limits our ability to experience God's guidance. When we insist on directing every step, we leave little room for God to lead. Surrender opens our hearts to His direction and allows us to recognize His hand at work in unexpected ways. Often, God's guidance becomes clear only after we release our insistence on having our own way. Letting go of control is rarely a one-time decision. It is a daily practice that requires intentional trust. Each day presents new opportunities to either reclaim control or reaffirm surrender. Some days are easier than others, but every act of surrender strengthens our faith. Over time, we begin to notice a change not only in our stress levels, but also in our perspective. When we surrender, we learn to rest even in uncertainty. We discover that peace does not require answers. It requires trust. God does not promise to explain everything, but He promises to be present in everything. His presence provides reassurance that no matter what happens, we are not alone. Surrender transforms how we face challenges. Instead of reacting with panic, we respond with prayer. Instead of obsessing over outcomes, we focus on faithfulness. This shift does not eliminate difficulties, but it changes how we experience them. Peace becomes a steady companion rather than a distant goal. As we release control and trust God with our future, we experience a deeper sense of freedom. We are no longer driven by fear of what might happen, but anchored by confidence in who God is. In surrender, we find rest, and in trusting God, we discover a peace that remains even when circumstances are uncertain. Many people look at delays, closed doors, and past failures as evidence that something has gone wrong, but in God's plan, these experiences are often signs that something is being prepared. We tend to measure progress by speed and success by immediate results, but God measures progress by growth and success by faithfulness. What feels like a setback to us may actually be a season of shaping, where God is working beneath the surface in ways we cannot yet see. Waiting is one of the most challenging parts of the journey of faith because it confronts our desire for control and quick answers. When progress slows or stops, fear and doubt often step in. We begin to question God's timing, His intentions, or even His presence. Yet delays are not proof of God's absence. They are often evidence of His careful attention. God does not rush His work because what He is building in us is meant to last. Past failures can be especially difficult to reconcile with trust in God's plan. Failure has a way of lingering in our memory, shaping how we see ourselves and our future. We may replay mistakes over and over, believing they have disqualified us from what God wants to do. But God does not view failure the way we do. He sees it as an opportunity for refinement and growth. What we call failure, God often uses as instruction. God's preparation often happens in hidden seasons. These are times when there is little recognition, little affirmation, and little visible progress. Yet these seasons are critical because they build character, patience, and dependence on God. Without preparation, success can become destructive rather than beneficial. God prepares us not only for what we will do, but for who we must become in order to handle what lies ahead. Closed doors can feel like rejection, especially when we have invested time, effort, and hope into a particular direction. But a closed door is not always a denial. Sometimes it is protection. God sees dangers and distractions we cannot see. When He closes a door, it is often because the path behind it would ultimately lead us away from His best. Trusting God means believing that what He prevents is just as important as what He provides. Delays also teach us to listen more closely to God's voice. When life moves quickly, it is easy to rely on our own instincts and abilities. But in waiting, we are reminded of our need for God's guidance. Waiting strips away self-reliance and replaces it with dependence. This dependence deepens our relationship with God and aligns our hearts with His will. One of the greatest dangers during seasons of delay or after failure is discouragement. Discouragement whispers that the wait is pointless and the past is unforgivable. But God's timing is purposeful and His grace is sufficient. He does not waste seasons, and He does not abandon people because of mistakes. The same God who forgives also restores, and restoration often comes with greater wisdom and humility. Preparation is not always comfortable. God may use challenges, disappointments, and unanswered questions to stretch our faith. These experiences teach us perseverance and trust. Without them, our faith would remain shallow and easily shaken. God allows difficulty not to harm us, but to strengthen us for the responsibilities ahead. When we look back later, we often realize that the waiting and failures were essential parts of the journey. They taught us lessons we could not have learned any other way. They shaped our values, clarified our priorities, and deepened our trust in God. What once felt like wasted time becomes recognized as necessary preparation. Trusting God in these seasons requires patience and humility. It means accepting that God's schedule is different from ours and that His ways are higher than our ways. As we remain faithful in waiting and willing to learn from past mistakes, we position ourselves to step into what God has prepared. The delays and failures that once caused pain become testimonies of God's faithfulness and wisdom at work in our lives. Letting go of fear is not a single moment of decision, but a daily intentional choice that shapes how we live and how we respond to life's uncertainties. Many people assume that once they decide to trust God, fear will disappear permanently, but fear has a way of returning in new forms and new situations. Each day presents fresh concerns, unexpected challenges, and moments that test our confidence. Faith, therefore, must be renewed daily through conscious trust in God. Every morning, we face a choice about what will guide our thoughts and actions. Fear urges us to anticipate problems, protect ourselves, and remain guarded. Faith invites us to trust God's guidance, even when circumstances are unclear. His choice may seem small, but over time it has a powerful effect. Each decision to trust God weakens fear's influence and strengthens spiritual confidence. Faith grows through repetition, just as fear does. Daily trust requires intentional focus. Our minds naturally drift toward worry, especially when faced with uncertainty. News, conversations, and past experiences can all fuel anxious thoughts. To counter this, we must regularly remind ourselves of who God is and what He has promised. Trust deepens when we consistently redirect our attention from our fears to God's faithfulness. What we focus on most often becomes what shapes us. Prayer plays a vital role in surrendering fear each day. Prayer is not merely a request for answers or solutions. It is an act of placing our concerns into God's hands. When we pray honestly, we acknowledge our fears without allowing them to control us. Through prayer, we exchange anxiety for assurance and uncertainty for peace. This daily exchange is how faith is sustained. Letting go of fear also involves learning to respond differently to challenges. Instead of immediately reacting with panic or frustration, faith encourages us to pause and trust God's presence. This pause creates space for wisdom and perspective. Over time, this new pattern of response becomes natural, and fear loses its urgency. Trust becomes the default reaction rather than worry. Consistency in trust transforms our inner life. While circumstances may remain unpredictable, our hearts become steadier. We begin to experience peace that does not depend on external stability. This peace comes from knowing that God remains in control even when we are not. The more consistently we trust Him, the less power fear has over our emotions and decisions. Daily trust also builds spiritual resilience. Life inevitably brings trials, disappointments, and transitions. When fear is surrendered regularly, we are better prepared to face these moments with strength and clarity. Each day of trust adds another layer of confidence, making us less vulnerable to discouragement when difficulties arise. It is important to recognize that growth in faith is gradual. Some days fear feels easier to release, while other days it feels persistent and overwhelming. God is patient in this process. He does not expect instant perfection, but faithful persistence. Each effort to trust Him, no matter how small, is meaningful. Over time, these small acts of faith accumulate into lasting spiritual maturity. Trusting God daily also reshapes our perspective on the future. Instead of fearing what might happen, we begin to anticipate God's guidance and provision. The future no longer feels like a threat, but like a journey we will walk with God. This shift brings hope and expectation rather than anxiety. As trust becomes a daily habit, fear gradually loses its dominance. We learn that fear does not have the authority to dictate our choices or define our direction. God's faithfulness becomes more real through lived experience, not just belief. Each day of trust confirms that God is worthy of our confidence and that placing our lives in His hands leads to a deeper sense of peace and assurance that carries us through every season. As we bring all these truths together, we are reminded that fear loses its power when our trust is placed fully in God. The journey ahead may not be clear, and the path may not unfold the way we expect, but God's character remains unchanging. He leads with wisdom, love, and purpose, even when we cannot see the next step. When we shift our focus from the unknown to who God is, obedience becomes possible even without confidence. Surrender replaces anxiety, waiting becomes preparation, and daily trust strengthens our faith. God never asks us to figure everything out. He asks us to follow Him. Every step taken in faith, no matter how small, moves us closer to His will. Fear may still knock at the door, but it does not have to control our decisions. As we learn to release control, trust God's timing, and surrender our future into His hands, we discover a peace that does not depend on circumstances. This peace anchors us in uncertainty and reminds us that God is always at work, guiding us forward. When you choose to let go of fear and trust where God is taking you, you step into a life led by faith rather than anxiety, confidence rather than doubt, and hope rather than worry. Wherever the road leads, you can walk it with assurance, knowing that the God who called you is faithful to lead you, sustain you, and bring His purpose to completion in your life. And you can rest in the truth that the safest place you will ever be is in the center of God's will.